speaker, Professor Dan Laufer from Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. So good morning, Dan. We really appreciate you being with us on your Friday evening. We're particularly grateful that Professor Laufer is taking the time because he is an expert on a really timely topic, global crisis management. We don't have to go far to identify a crisis. We're right in the midst of it. And Professor Laufer is really the expert to share his insights of how great leaders can manage those crises. He has the do's and don'ts for that situation, and he is willing to share that with us in a brief morning sessions this morning. Let me say a few words about Professor Laufer. He works in New Zealand at the Victoria University, but he also is one of the great showcases where academia meets practice. He is a very famous and world-renowned expert on his topic. He, for example, writes for the Wall Street Journal. He has a regular column in the New Zealand Herald. He consults politicians and business leaders on global crisis communication. So I'm pretty sure that we have a great chance into tapping into his wealth of experience and knowledge on crisis management. Dan, thank you very much for offering us the opportunity. And one thing I forgot, Professor Laufer is also teaching on our program. So for those of you who are interested in what an MBA lecture could be like, I think that's a great showcase to follow. So I wish us all a great morning, and I would hand it over to Professor Laufer now. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to talk about crisis communications. It's really great to talk to an audience in Vienna. I really had fond memories when I taught the MBA program a couple of years ago. And of course, Vienna is a beautiful, beautiful city, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, together with, of course, Wellington, the capital of New Zealand. Also, another comment I want to make about the topic of communicating with the media during a crisis. Of course, now with COVID-19, it's a very important topic, but regardless of COVID-19, it's important for a lot of different types of crises. And I've spoken about this topic to senior government officials here in New Zealand, including mayors on a number of occasions, and also to executives. So I'm really looking forward to giving this webinar about this important topic. So with that, I guess we'll start. Great. Okay, what do we have on the agenda for today? First of all, I'm going to start by talking about how the media frames a crisis. And that's an important starting point because before you can start preparing for communicating with the media, you have to get a sense of what they focus on when they report on a crisis. Then after that, I'll talk about important elements of an effective crisis response. So really the focus here is on the message. Then I'll shift to the delivery of the message. And the delivery of the message is, of course, related to the spokesperson. So we'll discuss what makes a spokesperson effective during a crisis. Then we'll see a video of an interview with the CEO during a crisis. And the crisis involves United Airlines and a very infamous crisis which made headlines around the world. And it involves the dragging of a passenger from a plane. And after that interview, you'll answer 2 questions, and then we'll discuss it. And then finally, I'll end by talking about research projects related to the topic that I've been involved with. And the research projects involve whether the CEO should be used as a spokesperson by multinational corporations during an overseas crisis. So I'm sure that you'll find all of these topics interesting. But let's start with, of course, what the media focuses on during a crisis. And this was a very interesting study that was conducted in the US. and it involved a content analysis. Essentially, the researcher looked to see in major newspapers in the US, how are crises reported? What sort of themes evolved in terms of the media reporting? And so here you have the main areas of focus of the media during a crisis. And the first, attribution of responsibility, essentially means who's to blame for the crisis. And for this, I want to mention the Boeing crisis, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, involving the plane crashes in Indonesia and Ethiopia. And so in terms of blame, the question that the media asks is, what caused the crisis? Was it something about the plane? Was it something about the pilot? Was it something about the weather? And so it's very important, in order to prepare for communicating with the media during a crisis, to be prepared for a question about attribution of responsibility. The other area that the media focuses on is the economic frame. So what sort of economic damage has resulted from a crisis? So in the context of the Boeing crisis, how much money are they going to lose as a result of the crisis? How much has the stock price gone down? So that's another focus of the media during a crisis. Another area of interest is the human interest frame. And what does that mean? That's essentially what is the plight of the victims like? So what has happened to the families of the victims of a plane crash? How has this impacted their lives? So really, it's a story, a personal story or angle from the perspective of a victim during a crisis. Another area of focus of the media involves a conflict frame. And for this, I'll give you two examples, one related to COVID-19 and the other another context. So with regards to COVID-19, for those of you following the news in the US, which of course isn't very positive, unfortunately, these days, you probably have noticed a lot of discussion around federal responsibility versus state responsibility and local responsibility for COVID-19, for restrictions and rules and guidelines. And in terms of the conflict frame, what you probably have noticed with media coverage is a debate around who's responsible, whose fault it is. So that relates to a conflict frame. Another example of a conflict frame involves a strike. So if you have a crisis involving a company and a union, a lot of times the media will talk about the union versus the company. And so that's another example of a conflict frame. And then the last frame I want to mention here, which was in the study, is called the morality frame. And this is really important to understand from a crisis management standpoint. A lot of people in companies and organizations like to focus on and latch on whether something is legal. And if a company is following the law, then that's all that matters. And that, of course, would be a big mistake, because the focus of the media a lot of times isn't just, okay, was this lawful? The media also likes to ask whether what the company did in terms of its actions was the right thing to do. Even if it wasn't necessary under the law, shouldn't they have done more? And I'll give you an example, actually, from a crisis currently in New Zealand involving a company, and it involves Air New Zealand, which is the national carrier of New Zealand. And so it involves giving refunds to customers for canceled flights. Now, according to the law in New Zealand, Air New Zealand doesn't have to give refunds for the canceled flights. It's enough to give a credit on a future flight. Now, there's been a big debate going on in the public about whether that's fair. And so a morality frame would essentially be focusing on whether Air New Zealand is treating customers the right way, regardless of whether legally they're required to refund the money. Okay, now I want to shift focus, since we now know what the media focuses on in terms of topics around a crisis. I want to talk about elements of an effective response and really focusing a lot on the message. And so one thing that's very important is to respond quickly. And for this, I want to talk about a crisis involving BASF, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's the largest chemical company in the world. It's a German company. And I was very fortunate to have interviewed the head of corporate communications at BASF around a crisis that happened to them a couple of years ago. There was an explosion in their chemical plant, and there were a number of people killed and injured as a result of that crisis. And one of the things that they follow in terms of their crisis response is issuing a press release within 30 minutes of any crisis that occurs at BASF. And sure enough, within 30 minutes, they issued a press release after the explosion that happened in the chemical plant. Now, they don't know, of course, within the first 30 minutes exactly what's happening. But what's important in terms of that response and that quick response is that they're signaling to stakeholders that they realized a crisis has happened, and they explain what they're doing to gather more information, and that they will issue additional statements as things become clearer. And the reason that's so important is because if there's a vacuum, that vacuum of information is filled by other parties. And so the media is not going to wait. They're going to ask other people about the situation, and those other people or entities are not going to be necessarily sympathetic to a company's plight. So if they go to a company's competitors or former employees, the message around the crisis can be pretty detrimental to a company. And so it's very important to respond as quickly as possible. The other aspect in terms of an effective response is consistency. And here I want to actually give an example from COVID-19, and I want to give examples from the US and New Zealand. Now, New Zealand has been praised for its response to COVID-19. We're very fortunate in that currently we haven't had any new cases in a week, and there's only one active case in the whole country. So everyone has recovered. There's no one in the hospital. And the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, has gotten a lot of praise for the government's response. Now, there is one aspect to the response that relates to consistency that really came out in terms of the media recently. So there were documents released about how the government responded to the crisis. And a number of documents mentioned that any sort of response regarding COVID-19 has to be approved by the Prime Minister's office. Now, the media kind of focused on the control that the Prime Minister has over the message, and didn't actually report it in such a positive light. But actually, that is exactly what needs to happen. There needs to be consistency in the message in order for it to be effective. And so that's exactly the type of response that you need. Now, let me contrast that with the US and Donald Trump and the inconsistency in the message. Now, President Trump, in terms of his messages, the message changes frequently. And so you have inconsistency in the message within an individual. So here we're just talking about one person. But consistency doesn't only relate to the communications from one individual. It also relates to the communication of a message within an organization by a number of people. So you could have a number of people communicating. And in a large organization, that is typical. You can't always expect just one person communicating the message. It's fine to have a number of people as long as you're communicating the same message. Now, the problem with the message coming out of the US is that since President Trump is changing his message, his team doesn't know what they need to be communicating. So you also have inconsistencies in terms of the message that's communicated among the members of a team. Okay, I want to shift to another important aspect of an effective crisis response and the importance of being open. Jacinda Ardern has been very open in terms of communication. So every day during the COVID-19 crisis, there was a press conference and she made a statement and then afterwards patiently answered the questions of reporters. So she was very accessible. Now, I'll contrast that to another crisis actually here in New Zealand. There was a volcano explosion a couple of months ago in White Island, and there were over 20 people killed and over 20 people injured as a result of that volcano crisis, which made headlines around the world because also there were tourists that were killed and injured during that natural disaster. Now, the police were heavily criticized, the New Zealand police were heavily criticized for their performance during that crisis. And one of the things that was mentioned was that during a press conference, they were unhappy with the questions, and so they just left. And so that's an example of not being open to questions during a crisis. It's very important to be open and to provide access. Okay, another thing that's very important is to express sympathy during a crisis. And expressing sympathy during a crisis doesn't necessarily mean you're assuming responsibility for the crisis. You can still be sorry for the plight of victims without accepting responsibility for what happened. So in a plane crash, you can have a situation, for instance, that you have pilot error or you have weather conditions that have caused a plane crash. And still, a company like Boeing should express sympathy for the plight of the victims, even though there's nothing that the crisis wasn't triggered by something related to the plane that they manufactured. Another thing that's important in terms of an effective crisis response is instructing stakeholders about what to do during a crisis. So let's take a product recall for an example. During a product recall, people have a defective product, and it's very important for consumers to return defective products or do something to protect themselves from harm. So it's very important for the company to provide clear instructions on how consumers can protect themselves from harm. You see something similar, of course, with COVID-19 and instructions on how the public can protect themselves from harm from getting the virus. So that's very important in terms of an effective crisis response, to provide very clear instructions about what to do. And finally, the last point, taking ownership for crisis and making changes when necessary. And for this, I want to give you an example involving Air New Zealand that I wrote about in my column a couple of months ago. So Air New Zealand, after the Christchurch shooting, so there was a Christchurch shooting in a mosque a couple of months ago, which made headlines around the world. Now, after this happened, around the same time, prices went up significantly in terms of airfare to fly to Christchurch. And the airline was criticized, not only in the public and in the media, but also by the finance minister for increasing prices during, of course, a tragedy. Now, how did this happen? It happened because Air New Zealand, of course, has a system that assesses the demand for its flights, and it saw that the demand for flights to Christchurch increased dramatically, and it raised prices as a result. Now, in terms of its response when it was criticized, it simply said that it would reduce the price or keep the price at a certain level, but it really didn't apologize and explain what happened. It didn't essentially say, okay, our systems are designed in a way that factor in demand in our pricing, and as a result, the prices increased. However, we realize that in these types of situations and also natural disasters, we can't just rely on the demand. There has to be judgment involved too in terms of the increase of prices, and we've made changes to the system. You see, that would be an example of taking ownership for a crisis and making changes. Unfortunately, they didn't do that in terms of their statement, and instead, they focused on corporate social responsibility messages. So things along the lines of, during the crisis, we also helped. So this is also an important aspect of an effective crisis response, to take ownership and make changes if necessary to the system. Okay. Moving on, I want to shift gears and talk about delivery of the message. What's important? So it's important to convey both concern and control. And this is really a tricky thing, because on the one hand, if you convey too much concern, sometimes that can be perceived as not really being in control and focusing on preventing things from happening. And on the other hand, if you focus too much on control aspect, or how to prevent a crisis from happening in the future, people can interpret that as not being or showing enough empathy and concern for the victims. So there has to be a balance of both. And also, what's important here is authenticity. People have to believe what you're communicating. And in the next slide, I'll talk about body language. Body language plays a big role in people perceiving that what you're saying you sincerely believe in. So that is important to keep in mind. And finally, you see the last bullet point: an effective spokesperson will increase the likelihood that stakeholders will accept the company's version of the story. That's the key. I mean, that's really important. You want, as an organization, your version of the story to be communicated. And so you really have to choose the right communicator to do that. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, related to authenticity, we have body language. And in terms of body language, before going into the various points here, there is a cultural dimension to this. And even within Europe, there are differences. So, for instance, in Italy, people are a lot more animated and emotional when you compare them to people in Scandinavia. So in terms of these guidelines, you have to also take into consideration the cultural context and adapt it. So let's talk about some of these aspects of body language. The first one, maintaining eye contact with an audience. So in certain cultural contexts, like the US, if someone doesn't maintain eye contact, people infer from that that the person isn't trustworthy and the person is not telling the truth. However, in other cultural contexts, when you're not supposed to make eye contact, so places like Saudi Arabia, it's really frowned upon. Now, another aspect of body language involves hand gestures to emphasize points. So in Italy, people use hand gestures a lot more than people in Scandinavia. I lived in Israel for a couple of years, and people use hand gestures a lot. And they use hand gestures a lot more than in New Zealand, for instance. Varying voice to avoid a monotone delivery. So similar in Italy and in Israel, people vary their voice a lot. In New Zealand, they don't do it as much. And finally, facial expressions. Um, Once again, from a cultural standpoint, certain places you see more changes in facial impressions. Israel, Italy, as opposed to others where people are more reserved. So the UK and New Zealand. Now, another thing that's very important is verbal communications. So, answering questions effectively. Um, for this one, I want to give you an example from a seminar that I gave to mayors, and the importance of going beyond giving general statements and providing supporting statements. So, what has been a major issue for mayors here in New Zealand? Water contamination and the quality of water. So when there are issues around water contamination, of course, it's very important to communicate to people in your city that you're in control over the situation and that you can fix the problem. Now, just saying things are under control and we're going to fix the problem is, of course, not sufficient. You need to provide support for that statement. And so many people fall into the trap of just saying general things without providing additional information that they're suddenly put on the defensive by reporters asking, so you say that the situation is under control and the quality of water is good, but you haven't provided evidence of that. So have you fixed the system? How are you going to fix the system? So this is very important, and a lot of people don't do that, unfortunately, when they communicate. They do not provide supporting evidence for general statements. The second thing I want to mention with regards to verbal communications is the importance of presenting crisis information clearly. Experts and politicians a lot of times use very technical terms that the general public does not understand. And it's important to translate that information into language that the audience understands. And I'll give you a concrete example. So, as I mentioned previously, as a result of that volcano crisis, there were a lot of people injured and they had very serious burns. Now, this issue of burn victims and the percentages of burns, so when they say 70% burns, it's not really well understood by the public. And so what the doctors did from the hospital when they spoke with the media was they did something that was very effective. One doctor showed the palm of his hand and he said, this represents 3% of a person's body. So you can imagine what 80% burns is like. That is very effective. And really, when you communicate during a crisis, you have to be able to translate technical information into information that an audience understands. You have to provide context. And I'll give you another example. So, I mentioned earlier that over 20 people were injured as a result of that volcano eruption, and also there were over 20 people killed. Now, in terms of the hospital, they wanted to communicate to the public that this is really unprecedented in terms of the treatment that they have to give to the victims. And so how did they convey that? Because when you communicate to the public that 20 people are in hospital, people don't really get a sense of how much work is involved in terms of treating those victims. But what the doctors did was very effective. They said that 20 victims with serious burns in the hospital is the equivalent of an entire year of burn victims for New Zealand. That is what really needs to be done during a crisis. You have to provide context to your audience. And finally, the last thing I want to mention here is the importance of being able to handle difficult questions. And, the difficult questions really need to be anticipated, and you need to practice and prepare for an interview. And that can be done in a number of ways. First of all, people within the organization can act as reporters and ask questions to a spokesperson and try to come up with the most difficult questions they can think of. And how do they do this? First of all, the first slide that I showed you related to what the media focuses on, so that's a very good starting point. But also, it's very useful to go back and see interviews by the reporter, and you get a lot of insights into the reporter's style. So I'll give you one example of a difficult question that really everyone should be prepared for, especially a CEO during a crisis. And that's the question of, will you resign as a result of the crisis? So I'm always amazed at people who aren't prepared for that question and then are suddenly stunned that someone would ask that. And it's really a question that can easily be answered. Really, all the CEO needs to say is, no, I'm here to correct things and prevent things from happening in the future. So I view my role as someone who will manage the crisis and put actions in place that will prevent it from happening in the future. And that is a very acceptable answer to a question relating to, will you resign? So with that, we go to the fun part of the presentation, and that involves you watching a video. And this video is about 7 minutes long, and it involves an interview with the CEO of United Airlines, who's responding and talking to the media for the first time after the dragging of the passenger crisis. I'll give you 10 minutes, and I'll be back in 10 minutes, because at the end of the video, you'll have 2 questions to answer, and then I'll talk about the performance of the CEO. So with that, I'll be back in 10 minutes, and I look forward to reading the answers to the questions after you see the video. Okay, I think we're going to continue. I see that quite a few of you have voted, I would say about half, and over 70% of you felt that he did a good job, and less than 30% thought he did a poor job. Now, I want to analyze his performance, and I want to talk about it from the standpoint of the concepts that I discussed previously about effective crisis communications. And I want to start off by talking about control. Remember how I discussed the importance of being in control and also showing concern. And so in terms of showing control or demonstrating control, he could have done a better job in that he appeared to be very reactive as opposed to proactive regarding what the company is doing. So, for instance, a lot of things were driven by the reporter's questions, and he really needed to be a lot more proactive in his responses to the questions, and that the answers really were triggered too much by reporters' questions and not him initiating the information. Another aspect which you might have noticed is stating that there won't be in the future any more removal of passengers from a plane after they've boarded. It would have been useful to provide more information about what they're doing in order for that not to happen. You notice that the CEO talked a lot about common sense of employees, the common sense, but still the connection with, okay, passengers not being removed wasn't so clear. Really, the message wasn't coherent. There wasn't a logic between a lot of the things that he was saying. Another thing that's very important during a crisis is to convince the public that an investigation is effective. And he talked about an investigation and a review, but it would have been useful to also have some sort of independent, credible party be part of that investigation. So in terms of control, it was mixed. Now, in terms of compassion and concern, really there were major areas for improvement. You probably noticed, or some of you may have noticed, that he couldn't remember the name of the passenger. He said, the folk I mentioned before. So that shows a lack of concern. You really have to remember the name of the victim. Another thing, too, is the long pause after he was asked the question of whether the passenger was at fault for what happened. There was a long pause, and then only after that long pause, he said, of course not. Pauses really suggest or signal that someone isn't really sure of the answer. And then finally, with regards to body language, the monotone and the lack of hand gestures also shows a lack of authenticity, and that was problematic. So really, overall, he didn't do such a good job, and he was heavily criticized in the US for his performance. Now, there's a lot more I can talk about, and I really encourage you to go back to the points in the presentation that I've given and view the video again. I'm sure you'll pick up other things too. Now, due to the time constraints, we're really not going to have a lot of time to talk about the second part of the presentation, which relates to the CEO as a spokesperson during a crisis. And I can see here in terms of the voting, a lot of you believe that the CEO should be a spokesperson during a crisis. Now, I want to briefly comment on this issue without going through the slides, because I also want to leave time for some questions. And really, whether the CEO is a spokesperson during a crisis is a very complex decision that involves a number of factors. One, it involves the CEO in terms of his or her capabilities, and also in terms of whether, for instance, the CEO is a celebrity or not. So when most CEOs aren't celebrities, but you have quite a few that are. For instance, Steve Jobs was a celebrity CEO, Bill Gates of Microsoft, Elon Musk. And so if they're celebrities, they can help if the associations that they have, not just their popularity and the awareness of the public who they are, but what their characteristics are. So Bill Gates, for instance, is associated with philanthropic activities, so he could be effective in expressing, for instance, sympathy and empathy during a crisis. On the other hand, someone like Steve Jobs, who's known as someone who can get things done, would be effective in order to communicate control during a crisis. So that's one thing that's important to consider. Another aspect that's important to consider is the crisis itself. How serious is it? So getting back to that crisis involving BASF and the explosion in the chemical plant, that was a very serious crisis. Now, in terms of the crisis management plan, under the crisis management plan, the head of the plant, the chemical plant, was supposed to be the spokesperson during the crisis. But the company was heavily criticized because the CEO wasn't the spokesperson. Now, this is an excellent example of when the severity of the crisis is very high, you have to really rethink who the spokesperson is going to be. There is an expectation that the CEO should be a spokesperson when things are very serious. And it's similar with regards to culpability or blame. If the company is to blame, there is an expectation that the CEO should be the spokesperson. And finally, I want to talk about the characteristics of the audience. Now, certain audiences are more receptive to a CEO as a spokesperson than others. And this relates to some research that I conducted regarding power distance. And so a place like China is very high on power distance. And so having the CEO as a spokesperson is very important and useful. On the other hand, a place like New Zealand, which is very egalitarian, it's much more important to have an effective message, and who's communicating that message is not as important. So you don't necessarily need the CEO. Now, what I'll do is I'll send to Anna an article that I published recently on the topic of whether to use the CEO during a global crisis and the factors to consider. And she can distribute it to all of you so you can read more in depth about the topic, because it's a very important topic. And I think you'll find it useful, particularly since a lot of you, I'm sure, work at multinationals. And of course, multinationals have crises at various markets around the world. So with that, I'm going to end my part of the presentation, and I'll pass it over to Anna so she can continue.
Well, great. Thank you very much for that insight. Those are some really good tips and tricks we heard on the current situation of the crises now or the previous ones that we had. And I'm really excited that we were able to host this webinar right now. So thank you for your input. At this point, I'd like to open the floor for questions, because we have the opportunity to have an expert here answer your questions. Anything you might be wondering, dear participants, on crisis communication or perhaps international communication. Professor Laufer is really an expert and has lived in several countries and has done a lot of research as well. And he's here right now to give you some direct feedback. So if you have a question, keep them coming. Meantime, we'll let some people think about a question, and while they are, I've prepared also just a few slides on some scholarships that we have right now. So just some brief information. If you'd like more, you can get in touch with us. We have some scholarships right now for female leaders, as we know that it's important to have a large proportion of this group in our MBA programs. Right now we have around 35%, and we'd love to get that up to 50%. We're offering scholarships for female leaders, but also we offer scholarships for people in need. And we have our first question in. So, Alexander, please, if you'd like to ask a question. I've made you a presenter now, and you can turn on your microphone. Otherwise, if you'd like to ask a question in the chat box, feel free.
Oh, no, wonderful. I prefer it that way. Thanks, Professor Laufer, for this lecture. It was highly interesting. It's a complicated question. You ended with if a CEO or a leader of an organization should be the one who communicates, and you made it clear that there is no clear answer, yes or no, to this question. Another question that it's not easily answered by yes or no, but maybe you can give some insight, is whether a company should address an issue in crisis communication at all. Of course, you stated how important it is to be proactive, to be quick in your response, but on the other hand, there are many incidences where by overreacting, you might make a problem that is maybe small, just making it bigger by your reaction. There's this phenomenon of the so-called Streisand effect. Some may have heard of that. So maybe you can give some insight that don't make things worse by an overreacting crisis communication.
Yes, that's an excellent point. And let me explain that, I guess, in the context of the CEO as a spokesperson during a crisis. So I mentioned in the presentation that it's important to use the CEO as a spokesperson when things are very serious. So BASF was criticized for not having the CEO as a spokesperson during a crisis because it was a serious crisis. And even though they acted in accordance with the crisis management plan, they didn't really take into consideration the context. Now, your question relates to an overreaction. And so if you have a crisis that is not so serious, that's minor, relatively minor in nature, you run the risk of highlighting the crisis and making it worse if the CEO is the spokesperson, because then there's an inference made by the public and the media that actually, if the CEO is talking about this, it must be pretty important. And so you're absolutely right. You have to analyze the situation and assess how serious it is, and you have to be careful of an overreaction. So yes, a company definitely needs to consider these things in how they respond to a crisis.
All right, our next question is coming in from Ahmad Damitida. I've made you a presenter as well, so you can turn on your mic. In the meantime, Dan, Professor Laufer, would it be possible to share in the chat where we can read up on your best academic papers? Or if you want to email me this, you can also share it in follow-up emails.
Yeah, I'd be happy to send it. And also, I'll send you the interview that I had with the head of corporate communications at BASF. I published that in an article, and I think the participants will find that very, very interesting and useful, because she talks about various issues that BASF faced during the crisis. Not only the CEO as a spokesperson, which was one question, but a lot of other things like social media and also communicating in a global context when the crisis isn't only happening in Germany, but outside of Germany, the company is also impacted.
Thank you. Ahmad, ready?
All right. Okay, thank you very much, Professor. Very good presentation. Now, my question is, how does whoever is responding during crisis on behalf of an entity manage instances where information that would be shared are sensitive to the global economy, to livelihood of people? For instance, if there is a large oil spill at a very large oil production facility, right, that helps support global economy and livelihood of people in general. And this CEO is meant to address certain critical issues that have risen as a result of this crisis to the media. Now, knowing the way the media is, different interpretations, and of course, sometimes it can get very detrimental to livelihood, to the economy. So how does the CEO manage, or whoever is representing the company manage the situation? Thank you.
If I understood the question correctly, when you say If the CEO has to communicate during a crisis and the communications involves perhaps harming the economy of the country, when at the same time that information is important in terms of explaining what happens, it's a delicate balancing act because on the one hand, of course, when you're communicating information, that information is received by different audiences or different stakeholders. So let's say on the one hand, say this is an oil company, you have customers that are receiving the message, but at the same time, you have the government where you're operating in also receiving the message. So it's a delicate balancing act because you need both. And so, of course, from an ethical standpoint, you have to communicate information in a fair manner and in an accurate manner. But there's also an act of diplomacy that needs to be done in communicating, because you also have to take into consideration the interests and concerns of the different stakeholders. Basically, what I'm trying to say is it's a very complex situation, but you have to play out the scenarios and you have to understand what the various interests are of the different players. So when you're communicating, you have to really think about these things when you craft a message.
Great question. We have also another question from Dragos, who's wondering how you might describe the reaction of the media in terms of the current COVID-19 crisis. Do you think it was appropriate, or was it focused on facts, or just maybe to get attention and draw an audience?
I think you have to ask yourself, well, that's a complicated question, and it's a very good question. It depends on the media outlets. I'm sure there are some media outlets that may be focusing on crises, and in this case, COVID-19, in order to generate interest and traffic to websites. And this is true not only to COVID-19. The news media is a business just like others. And so they're looking to see what the audience is interested in terms of news. And so things like COVID-19 are of great interest to people. And so they will highlight that. Those of you, I don't know if it was reported on in Vienna, but the New York Times had a very controversial or very unusual headline regarding the victims in the US, the people that died when it reached 100,000. And the whole page was a list of some of the victims. And so the answer to your question is, and this is not only relevant to COVID-19, it's relevant to other crises as well. The news focuses on, or the media focuses on, what it thinks will be of most interest to its readers. And so if it thinks that a story is going to attract interest, it'll focus on that story.
True, because who has the most views perhaps also has a lot of support then later on. Now,
right, and also, it drives up readership. It means that in terms of ads, they'll get more money for ads. And so it's important to always remember that newspapers are businesses as well. They're not doing very well, but they're trying to generate profits and revenue. And one way of doing it is focusing on stories that are of interest.
Great. Well, we have a few questions coming in, so I hope it's okay for Professor Laufer and for our participants that we maybe tack on another 5 minutes or 10 perhaps to see how the flow goes. Great, thank you.
Yeah,
and so Eric is wondering if there's any ways to effectively measure the efficiency of crisis communication within a team.
The efficiency of crisis communication during a team. Okay, so in terms of teams, so you have crisis management plans, you have crisis communication plans. And after the crisis, you really want to assess the effectiveness of the communications. It's very hard in the midst of a crisis to do it because you're so busy dealing with the crisis. But what are some ways to assess performance during a crisis? So, I'll give you one example, media coverage. How was the media coverage of the company during the crisis, after the crisis, and seeing, okay, what sort of actions were taken by the company, and try to assess whether there's a connection between the media coverage and the actions that a company took. Now, part of that assessment, too, is the effectiveness of a team, because people within a crisis communication team, have various functions. And so you can try to identify whether there's some sort of connection between their areas of responsibility and the effectiveness of communications. Now, it's very tricky because, as you know, many of you probably know the difference between causation and correlation. There might be certain actions that are taken by a team, but it's very hard to assess, are those actions directly linked to certain results? And so in this case, I'm trying to link the connection of a crisis communications team and media coverage, or favorable or unfavorable media coverage. So the answer to your question is, of course, it's very complex, but an analysis really needs to be taken in terms of certain measures of performance after a crisis, like assessing media coverage, positive, negative, also the extent of media coverage in outlets, and also actions that were taken, and whether, for instance, a crisis communication plan was followed, or whether there were deviations from it.
Right, so crossing your T's and dotting your I's and making sure that you basically get an entire picture of the media coverage seems to be pretty important for our team then. And then
right. And it also could go beyond. I mean, I just gave an example here of media coverage, but similarly, the company should analyze social media activity. So what channels were used? What messages were used on the channels? What sort of reactions did a company get on social media? So, you can analyze it, and you should analyze it, not just the mainstream news media, but also in terms of social media activity.
Great, okay. And we'll just have a short announcement in terms of the other scholarships available now for citizens of CIS countries, as well as Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Georgia. You are applicable to apply for what we have known as the Vedemosti Scholarship, up to 35% off MBA tuition. If you're interested, please get in touch with me. We also have scholarships available for people working in the sectors of renewable energy or power utilities, up to 25% of the MBA tuition for the MBA in energy management. And I'm also very pleased to know that we have some future students joining us today from this energy management MBA. and as well as from other MBA programs, and it's really great to have you all here. So if there aren't any further questions, it looks like our listeners have been pretty active, and so without further ado, I'd like to thank you as well, Professor Laufer, for your time, for joining us all the way with the 10-hour time zone difference in New Zealand to give your lecture.
No, my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. I mean, it was a pleasure talking to an audience in Vienna. Not only in Vienna, I'm sure they're all from all around. I remember I had students from all around the world when I taught the MBA course, and they're very good students. And it's always a pleasure. So thank you for inviting me.
Wonderful. And thank you as well for our great IT support of Ivan Grabic in the background, making this run smoothly, and to Professor Stöttinger for her welcoming words at the introduction. It was wonderful to have you here, dear listeners, and I wish you all a great day, stay safe, and hope to see you soon at the WU Executive Academy's next event. We'll be having another lecture as well online already on June 8th. This will be off on the topic of strategic management with the COVID-19 crisis. So stay tuned. If you're interested in that, you can please get in touch with me or with our MBA team. And that's it from my side. Take care.